A little girl vanished from her backyard while her mother was just steps away. The town searched. The woods remained still. Time moved on, but her mother never let go of the silence that followed. Then, after a violent storm, the rain softened the earth, revealing a forgotten shape buried deep in the mud. And with it, the truth began to rise. Linfield, a quiet town, tucked between pine-covered hills and sleepy roads that rarely saw anything more alarming than a teenager sneaking a beer behind the general store. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your name, and the sound of screen doors slamming in the evening meant supper was ready. In a modest tan-colored house on Deerbrook Lane lived the Morgan family, Jeremy, Lauren, and their 5-year-old daughter, Haley. To outsiders, they were picture perfect. There's even a photograph that people would later call chilling. Jeremy, in his pressed brown suit, seated with a glass of whiskey in one hand and a thick cigar in the other. Lauren beside him, her hair curled to perfection, smiling gently. And Haley, sitting in front, small hands folded in her lap, eyes cast downward. Not in sadness, just in the strange quiet way some children have when they live in the shadows of unspoken things. Jeremy worked as a mechanic, a tall man with a rigid spine and colder eyes. He was known around town for his silence. He wasn't unkind, just distant. Some said the war had taken pieces of him no one could return. Lauren, on the other hand, was warmth in human form. A former school teacher, she'd given up her job after Haley was born. She poured everything into her daughter: books, bedtime songs, afternoon baking. She tried to give Haley the kind of safety she herself never had growing up. Their home sat on the edge of a wooded area. Tall oaks and maples lined the backyard like a natural curtain. Lauren warned Haley never to wander into the woods. "Stay close where I can see you," she'd say, pressing a kiss to her daughter's forehead. But like all children, Haley was curious. She would wander close to the tree line, especially when her mother was folding laundry or distracted on the phone. The woods were mysterious, filled with the rustling of birds and the snapping of branches. To a 5-year-old, they weren't dangerous. They were magic. The day she vanished started like any other. It was the last week of August, and the heat was beginning to dull into the cooler air of early fall. That morning, Lauren made pancakes shaped like stars. Jeremy left early, mumbling something about an urgent job at the garage. Haley sat at the kitchen table in her favorite blue dress, the one with tiny white flowers sewn into the hem. She asked if she could play outside after breakfast. Lauren agreed, but told her to stay where she could be seen from the kitchen window. Haley took her doll and toddled out to the backyard, her small shoes making soft thuds on the porch steps. She sat under the oak tree that always dropped the biggest leaves, lining them up like treasures. At one point, Lauren saw her from the window, humming to herself. Then the phone rang. It was only a 5-minute call, a friend inviting her to a church bake sale. When Lauren looked back out the window, the spot beneath the oak was empty. At first, she wasn't alarmed. Haley often wandered around the corner to the side of the house to chase butterflies or collect rocks. But after calling her name several times and receiving no response, Lauren stepped outside. There was no sign of her. She searched the immediate area: the porch, the garage, behind the hedges. Still nothing. Within 20 minutes, she was knocking on neighbors' doors. "Have you seen Haley? She was just in the yard." The search began slowly, as these things often do. First a circle of a few concerned neighbors, then growing wider with the involvement of local police. Jeremy was called home from work. His reaction was contained. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply asked questions. Who had seen her last? What she was wearing? How much time had passed? Officers combed through the woods. Dogs were brought in. Helicopters scanned the area. But after 48 hours, nothing had turned up. No clothing, no footprints, no broken branches, no sounds heard by anyone. It was as though she had evaporated. The town of Linfield was shaken. Missing persons cases were rare, especially involving young children. Theories multiplied. Maybe she wandered too deep into the forest and got lost. Maybe she was taken by someone passing through. Maybe it was an accident covered up in panic. Rumors grew legs in grocery stores and church pews. Everyone had a theory, but no one had an answer. Jeremy and Lauren reacted in stark contrast. She spiraled. She stopped brushing her hair, stopped sleeping. She clung to hope with the desperation of a mother who needed to believe her child was still out there. Every creak in the house made her look up. Every car that slowed near the street made her hold her breath. Jeremy, on the other hand, built a wall around himself. He didn't speak to reporters. He didn't weep publicly. He worked long hours at the garage and came home smelling of oil and steel, slipping silently into the shadows of the house. His way of grieving, some said. Others weren't so sure. More than once, a neighbor said they heard shouting from the house late at night. Lauren sobbing, accusing. Jeremy snapping back. But they stayed together. What else could they do? By the end of the year, flyers had faded. Tips dried up, and the room with the pale pink curtains remained untouched, waiting for a child who never returned. And for the next 14 years, the woods behind the house remained still, untouched, unbothered, but holding their secrets deep beneath the earth. Time has a way of dulling noise, but not pain. In Linfield, after the initial wave of chaos faded, the silence around Haley's disappearance became deafening. By 1992, search parties had disbanded, flyers were taken down, and Haley Morgan's name was no longer spoken aloud. In town, without a whisper of pity or unease. Her case was filed away in a box labeled Unsolved, placed on a shelf that no one wanted to visit. Jeremy and Lauren remained in the same house, though it didn't feel like home anymore. The walls were quiet, but the air was heavy, like the house itself remembered. Haley's room was left untouched. Her small shoes lined neatly beneath the window. Her dolls arranged with care on the shelf. Dust began to settle, but Lauren never let it rest for long. Every Sunday she cleaned the room, humming softly, as if pretending Haley might walk back in any minute. Lauren became consumed by obsession. She read every newspaper story about missing children, watched true crime shows late into the night, and kept a notebook filled with sketches, clippings, and notes in her own hand. It wasn't just about Haley anymore. It was about why. Why do children vanish without sound or sign? Why did no one see what happened? She walked the woods alone sometimes, calling Haley's name long after hope had frayed. Sometimes she swore she felt a breeze answer back. Each year, on August 27th, she tied a yellow ribbon around the oak tree where she last saw her daughter. Each year, fewer neighbors came to offer comfort. Jeremy buried himself in work. He stopped talking about Haley almost entirely. His behavior drew attention, even quiet suspicion. If asked, he said the same thing. Talking won't bring her back. He worked extra hours at the auto shop, spent more time in the garage, and rarely came in for dinner. There were days when he wouldn't speak at all. They drifted apart in slow, invisible ways. Conversations became rare. Shared meals became silence. Eventually, Jeremy moved into the guest room. People in Linfield noticed but didn't pry. Some things were too fragile to touch. In 1998, a new family moved in down the street. Their daughter reminded Lauren of Haley. The same dark hair, same small hands. One afternoon, Lauren saw her walking near the tree line and panicked. She ran outside, heart pounding, calling the girl back before she could take another step. The child was confused, and her mother never let her near the woods again. Word spread. "That woman," they said. "Still not right after all these years." But Lauren didn't care what people thought. She couldn't let it go. Not when the one thing she needed most had vanished so quietly. Jeremy, meanwhile, began talking to no one. At times, he sat in the garage for hours in silence, staring at the corner where the old washer used to be, long before he replaced it. No one noticed the storm clouds forming. Not in the sky, but beneath the surface of memory. 14 years passed, and the woods, like secrets, waited. It had been raining for 3 days straight in Linfield. Not the soft, rhythmic kind of rain that lulled people to sleep, but violent, thunder-rattling storms that clawed at the trees and flooded the ground. The town was soaked, swollen with water, as if the earth itself was trying to purge something buried too long. On the morning of the 4th day, the storm broke. The air hung damp and heavy. The roads were slick with mud, and deep puddles had formed at the edges of the woods behind the Morgan house. Lauren stood on the porch, watching water drip from the eaves, her eyes drawn, always, to the trees where Haley had last been seen. She went out anyway, umbrella in hand, her boots sinking into the soft earth with every step. It had become a ritual, walking to the oak tree on Haley's anniversary, though this time it was in August. Something pulled her out that morning, an instinct she couldn't explain. Near the clearing, where the woods opened into a low, muddy basin, something strange caught her eye. A rusted corner of metal jutted up from the soil. She moved closer. Half submerged in rainwater and mud stood a large, decaying appliance. A washing machine. Old. Boxy. The kind no one used anymore. The lid was caked shut with years of grime. It hadn't been there before, not in any of her walks. She would have seen it. It wasn't just forgotten. It had been hidden. Her stomach turned cold. It wasn't the machine itself that unsettled her. It was the way the ground seemed to have peeled it back, like the woods were finally ready to speak. Lauren stepped backward slowly, heart pounding, before pulling out her phone and dialing the police. The police arrived within the hour, unsure what to expect. At first glance, the rusted washing machine looked like nothing more than junk discarded decades ago. But Lauren's insistence and her history made them take it seriously. A perimeter was set. Photographs were taken. Forensics were called in. By midday, a team in gloves and masks was prying open the ancient lid, now fused shut from years of soil and corrosion. It took effort. When the top finally creaked open, the smell that escaped was stale and earthen, like rotted leaves and metal. Inside, instead of machinery, they found fabric, faded, torn, tangled. At the bottom, a tattered piece of a child's dress, blue with tiny white flowers. Lauren recognized it before the technician even lifted it. It was the dress Haley had been wearing the day she vanished. Silence fell across the clearing, Wrapped in the folds of damp clothing was something even more damning, a cloth tag, barely hanging on. The letters were smeared, but one half remained legible. Hale. That fragment of a name hit harder than any full sentence ever could. The discovery turned the cold case upside down. The washer was old, a late 80s model, rarely seen anymore. One detective, reviewing old statements, noted something peculiar. In the original investigation, Jeremy Morgan had mentioned replacing their washer just days after Haley vanished. He had claimed the motor failed. No one questioned it at the time. Now they were questioning everything. The machine was carefully removed and taken for further analysis. Soil samples, trace DNA, hair fibers, anything that could speak for a child who never got the chance. Investigators combed through town records and found receipts showing that Jeremy had indeed purchased a new washing machine on August 29th, 1991. Just 2 days after Haley went missing. Lauren's hands shook as she listened to the officers speak. Every word felt like a door unlocking, leading to something darker than she'd ever imagined. Not an accident of nature, not a stranger's crime. Something closer, something inside the house, inside the family. What haunted her most wasn't what they had found. It was the growing certainty of who had buried it. Jeremy Morgan sat in a small, windowless interview room at the Linfield police station, silent as the officers laid out the evidence. Photos of the rusted washer, the blue dress fragment, the receipt from 1991. For a long time, he didn't say a word. He simply stared at the table, fingers clasped, jaw clenched tight. When he finally spoke, it wasn't with anger. It wasn't even denial. It was quiet, hollow. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said. That night in 1991, he came home from work to find the house quiet. Lauren had gone to the store. Haley was in the garage, playing hide and seek. She was always crawling into places she didn't belong. Cupboards, closets, boxes. This time, she chose the washer. Jeremy said he didn't even realize she was in there until it was too late. The lid had locked, the old kind with no safety mechanism. When he found her, it was over. He didn't call for help. He didn't scream. He panicked. He told investigators that fear gripped him more than grief. He was afraid of what it would look like, that people would say he was responsible, that Lauren would never forgive him. So he waited until dark, loaded the washer onto the back of his truck, and drove into the woods. He buried it himself. For 14 years, he carried that silence like a second skin. It changed him, made him colder, more withdrawn. But the guilt never left. He said he thought about confessing every year on Haley's birthday, but he couldn't bring himself to say it out loud. When Lauren heard the full truth, she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply stood still, staring out the window of the station, as if watching something walk away forever. Haley's remains were finally laid to rest. No trial was needed. Jeremy pled guilty. The town, once again, fell quiet. But this time there was an ending. Not justice, perhaps, but truth.